it's very good to be together. My name is Nate, if I haven't met you. If you are a visitor, either you're jumping in online for the first time or in person, first we just want to acknowledge the courage it took. It's not easy to jump into something new, and so thank you for being courageous enough to do this, and we hope that you find this is a really safe place for you to explore and ask questions about who Jesus is. We really believe this. We believe that it's okay not to be okay. So if you're not okay, you're in really good company, all right? And we also believe that we don't want something from you, we want something for you. So we're not looking for people to be commodities in this gathering. We're looking for people who we can desire something for and see them grow. We want something for you, not something from you. So in our threads, what we're looking at is just these major themes that go throughout the Bible. We've taken 3 weeks, this will be the third week, to look at this whole idea of stewardship. In the first week, we looked at God has some just unbelievably liberating instructions for how we can live our lives financially and not be overwhelmed by some really powerful forces that exist out there. Last week, we looked at this idea of talents. There's a parable that Jesus teaches where he distributes something to 3 different people, and what they do with it really matters. And the whole emphasis of the parable would be this: whatever you've been given, do not bury it. Do not play it safe in your life. Jesus says, here's what I want. I want you to take what I've given you and your abilities and your capacities, and I want you, no matter how big or little it is, I want you to leverage it. I want you to invest it. I want you to impact the world through what I've given you. Now, this third week, we're not gonna talk about a resource that has any monetary value. Instead, we're gonna talk about how do we steward our lives, and we're gonna look at this word, the word blessing. Blessing is found throughout the scriptures. In the Old Testament, you'll find these patriarchs, these early Jewish fathers and mothers of the faith who make a choice to bless the next generation. And so blessing is something like this. It's not just like a nice word that you can hang up in your kitchen. It is literally this idea that in our highly individualized society, okay, so we live in a society where movie scripts and songs and poetry and books and television shows are all written oftentimes about this idea that it's you and your journey. You have to forge your own way, and everybody is so individualistic. It's just part of the heart, strength, and potentially a weakness of our culture is we have this individualized perspective on what life is all about. Well, the Bible has a different message than that. Yes, it's important that we look at our lives individually, but the Bible says something like this. It says that there is something that the generations who come before receive from God. Sometimes it's through mistakes, it's through hard knocks, and then they turn around and they pass it on to the next generation. So we don't have to start from scratch. And that generation takes what has been given to them, wisdom, experiences, truths about who God is, and passes it on to the next generation. So you and I do not have to forge our own pathway. Now, one of the things that I most admire about this church, I had nothing to do with it, we just stepped into it, is this is truly a multi-generational church. And believe it or not, that is very unusual. So I look around and I see people who have lived a lot of years and have had all kinds of experiences and have developed stories about who God is. And I look around and I see a bunch of people somewhere in the middle. I'm gonna generously include myself in that group. Somewhere in the middle where you're learning and you're experiencing and maybe you're raising kids or at the tail end of that. And then I see a whole bunch of young people. And I absolutely love that. If you came here on a Wednesday night, a couple years ago, we used to have our high school, junior high, 5th and 6th grade meet on the other end of this campus in our chapel, which only seats about 400 plus people. We had to move them into this room because if you came in here on a Wednesday night, the music would be at a higher volume than you were comfortable with, right? But you would see hundreds of young people who are experiencing the message of Jesus in their own way, and they're worshiping in a more demonstrative way than you did just a few minutes ago, okay? There's more bouncing and activity, okay? There's a little bit aerobic when they come in this room to worship. And it's just an absolutely stunning thing to have a gathering of people that includes everyone. But here's what it takes to make that work. It takes sacrifice on the part of each generation. It takes younger people who go, why can't this church ever get with it? We need to do hip hop worship, right? But they sit there and they go, well, my grandma, who also comes to this church, would not appreciate that. Therefore, I'm going to sacrifice because I believe that being a part of a multi-generational thing where there's wisdom from those ahead of me is worthwhile. So I'll sacrifice my preferences. And then on the other side, it takes some of us veterans who go, why can't we keep doing the same hymns that the church has been doing for 2,000 years? Why do we have to change this? They're so theologically rich, and I get it. I get it. It takes sacrifice from that group to go, but I want my kids and I want my grandkids to be a part of this Jesus thing. So everybody's got to sacrifice. So if you have just a church that has one demographic of people, it's impoverished. It's truly impoverished. Years ago, we thought that we were one day going to plant a church. And so we had identified some cities, and I went through all this training. And here's what they literally do in church planting theory. Is at one point, I had to lay down on a big piece of paper and somebody outlined my body. It looked like a murder scene. And then you hung it up on the wall and you had to define your target demographic. And they suggested, you probably want to look at like 29 to 32 upward mobility professionals. And so like they were telling me that like you have to define this demographic. And I began thinking, if I had a bunch of 30-year-olds at a church, that would be an impoverished church. Because we would need wisdom from people that are older than we are. And on the other end, you can have an impoverished church. I've got an example of that. Years ago, we had this little break in our schedule. And so we took our family, 4 kids, mom and dad, and we decided we're gonna travel the United States for 3 months. So we had a travel trailer and we pulled it, lost a couple of transmissions. It was like all kinds of goodness. But every weekend, one of the highlights is we would stop and visit a different church. And my kids had only been to churches like this. So one of the stops was in Calistoga, California, up near wine country. We just happened to be there. And one of the family members got to pick a church, and I still remember it was like Calistoga Community Church. So we showed up, parked the trailer, parked the truck. We went into church, and when we went in, we realized, this is not what we anticipated. There were 13 people present. Average age, I'm not joking, had to be early 80s. And we walked in and we're like, I wonder, but you know what? They were so happy to see us. I got grandma kisses all over my face. And they have been baking cookies that smell like that. We came in, we sat in service. And so 13 plus 6, it was like a pretty good sized service. And the pastor called the choir up and 9 of the 13 people went up to sing in the choir. And we're just like, they're so happy to have new people there. And then they came to a point in their service where they did prayer requests. And so people would raise their hand, the pastor would call on them. And all these prayer requests were mentioned. And then this lady who was right in front of us, she just kept looking at us and smiling. She raised her hand. She goes, Pastor, I don't have a prayer request, but I want to know about this young family. And the pastor looks at her and goes, Irma, you know this is not the right time for that. This is prayer request time. She looked at us And like after the service ended, it was like my kids had 13 new grandparents. They like rushed around them and they were so sad to hear that we had not just moved to town. They were like, oh, why? Because you had this group of saints who wanted to see their church continue. And if something didn't change, there wasn't a huge future for that church. But a group of people who are like, we're ready for the future. We're ready to pass something on. So to have a church that is full, we have to understand this idea of blessing and that things can be passed on. So I'd like to do this. I've got 5 passages from the Bible that all speak about blessing. Because when we think about blessing, it doesn't just mean that God's only done good things in my life. These passages of scripture will help us to understand there's something about passing it on, right? What I receive, I pass on to another. We're gonna read about some of the patriarchs. We're gonna read about Joshua. We're gonna read about Moses. We could read dozens and dozens of passages of scripture about blessing. But this will give us a framework. And then I've got 5 things I wanna say about what it means to be someone who passes on a blessing. First, Genesis chapter 47. Joseph has been the long lost son. He was mistreated by his brothers, sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. He ends up in this place of prominence. He's serving right under Pharaoh, who is the most powerful man in the world. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Now, I love this. You have Jacob, who we're gonna read in a few minutes. He's 130 years old. He's a herder. He's a nomad. And he ends up, because of what happened through his son, he ends up in front of the most powerful man in the world, the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh believes a different reality than what Jacob believes. Pharaoh worships all these gods that Jacob says, those are not true gods. He rules with certain values. But what does Jacob do? The nomadic sheep herder looks at Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and he says this: I'm not gonna start off this relationship by condemning you and telling you what you believe is not accurate. He says, I'm gonna bless you, Pharaoh. I'm gonna speak God's wisdom and truth upon you. I just want you to think about this in your own life. Sometimes we get very intimidated by people who have power, prestige, whatever it might be. Or we get in front of somebody who lives life really different than we do, and the first thing you want to do is you want to speak negatively. I want you to project this into the political realm. Here's what Jacob does. He goes, this is how we're going to begin this relationship, Pharaoh. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to pray God gives you wisdom to lead. I'm gonna pray God gives you guidance. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few, not so few, and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So our first blessing we're gonna look at is this man named Jacob, who's a veteran, who has lived life, and he looks at someone more powerful. He looks at someone very different than himself, and he goes, here's what I do. I bless you. I pray God's hand would be on you. Genesis chapter 48, just a chapter later, when Israel, which is another name for Jacob, saw the sons of Joseph. So because they had been separated, Jacob and Joseph, he didn't even know he had these 2 grandsons. He asked, who are these? They are the sons God has given me here, Joseph said to his father. Then Israel said, bring them to me so I may bless them. Then he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. It's the words of a grandpa to 2 grandsons he never knew. The God that walked with me, the God that protected me. This is what I speak over this next generation. Would he bless them the way he's blessed me? May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, bringing them into the sense of continuity. And may they increase greatly on the earth. Next passage is from Genesis chapter 49. Jacob, at the end of his life, brings all 12 of his sons to him. And the verses before this lay out the specific words he spoke to them. He's going to speak a blessing over them, but he's also, you got to know this about blessing. He also speaks really difficult truths to some of his sons. He speaks to them about the potential vulnerabilities in their life. And so as he speaks truth to them, he's old. He knows he's not going to live much longer. Each of his 12 sons, he speaks to them. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each the blessing appropriate to him. And then we're going to jump ahead to Exodus 39. Moses has called this big cooperative effort. People have come together and built the first tabernacle, which is a place where they came together for worship. And it took seamstresses and it took artisans, and they create this whole structure for a place of worship. And this is what Moses says upon completion of the job. The Israelites had done all the work just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Moses inspected the work and saw that they had done it just as the Lord had commanded. So Moses blessed them. You know what is oftentimes better than a paycheck? It's a word of affirmation. It's somebody looking at you and saying, be blessed. You did exactly what you're called to do. Thank you so much. And then lastly, this is Joshua, who is this warrior. He leads his people. They actually come into the promised land. He's at the very end of his life. And these are just these poignant words at the end of his life where he gathers all the people before his death. And he distills down all the lessons that he's learned and his earnest desires for their life, where Joshua says this, but be very careful to keep the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you. To love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, to hold fast to him and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. Then Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their homes. It's his final act as their leader, to remind them of what is most essential in life, to bless them and send them on their way. Okay, just a few passages of scripture that help us understand something about blessing. Here's what I'd like to talk about. Number one, I want to talk about the concept of continuity. Now, remember, we live in this highly individualized culture where we're so connected to people. Right, you can jump on a computer and talk to somebody, see their face when they live across an ocean. We have all these ways to connect, but sociologists tell us that there is more loneliness and more isolation than any time we've ever seen in the history of mankind. So we have this capacity to connect, but what part of what we're missing is this, is we're missing the concept of continuity. And that there is a generation that came before us who received something, and they pass it on to the next generation. And we receive that. And as families are challenged and broken, as we're dispersed, no longer do we live most people used to live just close to where they grew up. Now we're spread all over. This idea of continuity is so essential in the Bible. It was behind what Jesus did. He looked at his first followers 2,000 years ago, and he said, this is what I give you. I give you this hope, this perspective of who God is. I hand you my ministry. I hand you my message. And the first disciples of Jesus understood this continuity, and they took it and they lived it. And as they progressed through their life, they handed it off to the next generation. And that generation did not have to start from scratch. They took the message that had been passed on from Jesus to the generations before, and they passed it off. And now we're at 2022, and this concept of continuity is so important that what we receive, we turn around and we look at the people who will come after us. Because I can't tell you if Jesus is going to come back in 10 months or 1,000 years. But the idea that we keep passing it on is what has changed the world over the past 2,000 years. continuity, that you don't start by yourself. That there are people who can hand something to you that you can then hand off. The beauty of continuity. So here's what I like to say. I kind of want to break this up into 3 age groups, okay? I want to speak to the younger first. If you want to understand the biblical concept of continuity and blessing, if you're younger, here's just some words I have for you. Number 1, if you're younger, be humble. Be humble. Did you know that for thousands of years, young people have been saying this about the people who are older than them? They just don't get it. Right? I remember it was me, like my parents were so out of touch. They just don't get the modern world. You guys listen to 8 tracks, we have tapes. You're so far behind in technology. You just don't get it. And I'm watching my kids, Dad, you just don't get it. I'm like, apparently, and neither has any generation in the history of humanity. Part of that is there's this inbred confidence when you're young. If you're younger, you have 2 ways to learn lessons. I really believe this. Older man taught me this when I was just a young guy. He said, you can either learn lessons the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is you learn from the people who are ahead of you. The hard way is you make those same mistakes. Man, if there's something I can learn from you, if I can be humble enough to say, hey, rather than me make that same mistake, could you tell me about your mistakes? One of the things I love about the Bible is the Bible, so many portions of it are tragic. There's these heroic stories about people who do these unbelievable feats of faith. But you know how much of the Bible talks about the failure of people? It's never like candy coated. We learn about David and all his triumphs in terms of being a warrior king. But then the Bible says, but you need to know this about David too. That he was a man who compromised. And he made some really bad decisions, which led to tragedy in his life. A part of the continuity of the scriptures is, I want to learn from Samson. I want to learn from Moses. We get to learn from these people, and the stories are passed on to us so that we can live them out and pass them on to someone else. So if you're younger, be humble. Ask questions. Ask questions. Don't sit around and wait for somebody to teach you. I've got this young man who about 1.5 years ago approached me and he said, can I meet with you once every 6 weeks? I said, sure. So we've been trying to meet, and here's what he does. He has this notebook full of questions. And whenever we meet, he goes, okay, I've got 7 questions for you this week. I'm like, bring them on. Half of them, I'm like, I don't know. I'd love to learn that myself, but great question. But some of them, and here's what I love. This guy is going to accelerate his development and his maturity. And he's going to avoid some really difficult things by learning from the people ahead of him. If you're young, be humble. Be respectful. Look at people and think, what can I learn from you? Throughout the world, I've had the privilege to travel places. In most of the world, there's reverence and honor for older people. In US culture, we don't really have that. I think we could do that much better. I think simply because somebody has lived a long life, we should assume they probably know something I don't. And when you show respect to somebody who's older, it is a powerful, powerful tool. So to the younger, here's to the middle group, and I'm generously including myself in that. When you're in the middle, here's what I'd say. Quit feeling inadequate. This has really surprised me as I've gotten older. I still feel like a kid. And I feel inexperienced, and I feel like I don't have anything to say. And I feel like, well, what do I have to tell people? Like, I'm still learning. There is something, if you're in your 40s, if you're in your 50s, There is something that you have experienced that other people could learn from. Because I find you always feel younger than you actually are. I can't tell you how often I meet somebody and I'm in dialogue and they tell me how old they are and I'm like, seriously? That's how old I am. You seem so much older than me. You ever have that? You're like, really? Oh my goodness. Huh. Well, part of it is you just feel like, I don't know, I'm still a kid. So one of the things, if you're in that middle stage, I would say step up and be intentional in your relationships. Find people and just bring them along in the journey. Because it's really easy to just develop relationships that are peer-oriented and they're enjoyable and they're fun. But there is something powerful to just saying, hey, would you just join me in my life? I'm going on this trip. I'm doing yard work. Will you come over? Just part of the challenge of what our society faces is I am constantly encountering younger people who have a complete deficit of certain things in their life. They never saw a model of what it means to be a parent. They never saw a model of what it means to be someone who just disciplines themselves and studies the scriptures. They never saw a model for what a healthy marriage could look like. They've never been able to see, oh, this is what you do when you sit down to a dinner table and you can laugh and enjoy each other and talk about significant things. If you feel like, I'm not a mentor, I don't know what to do, just invite somebody in your life. Tell them some stories from the Bible. Tell them some stories from your life. And if you want a model for this, this is what I say to everybody in the middle. Look at the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy. 1st and 2nd Timothy. Paul writes these two books. He writes them to a young man named Timothy. And Paul finds Timothy early in Timothy's life. He's probably like late teen, early 20. And Paul identifies, here's a guy who, this is what Paul says, you had a grandmother who was a matriarch. You have a mother who's been faithful, but Paul never mentions his father. Very likely that Timothy had no father. And so here's what Paul says, Timothy, I just want you to come with me as I live my life. And Paul takes him on a journey, 2 journeys, around the known world, visiting churches. And Timothy learns, he watches, he sees. And then some years later, they get to the city of Ephesus, one of the largest cities in the ancient world. 750,000 people live there. And Paul looks at Timothy and he goes, Timothy, you've been just a part of my life for the last several years. Now I'm leaving you here. You're ready. You're going to be the pastor of this church in Ephesus. And Timothy seems to be like, no, like I don't want to do it. I don't want to stay with you, Paul. But Paul, as the older person, goes, no, it's time. It's time for you. And the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy are Paul writing to Timothy, who is being bullied by people in the church, specifically a woman. And he's just being like overrun by her. And here's what Paul says, like, step up, buddy. You can do this. To people who are teaching false things and Timothy's scared to correct it, Paul writes these 2 books and he reminds them of who he is. And Paul says, I believe in you. You can get through this. If you want a model for how to speak into somebody's life who's younger than you, read those books. Timothy needs to be encouraged, he needs to be corrected, and Paul does all of it. So if you're in the middle, include people in your life. Don't wait. Now's the moment. A multi-generational church needs you to be a part of it. Now, to the older, here's what I'd say. Tell meaningful stories. My kids tell me as I get older, I repeat the same stories over and over. And I guess I do. But here's what I won't mind. I won't mind if I repeat meaningful stories. I don't want to tell them about my pheasant hunting trip in North Dakota. They probably only need to hear that once. But if I could tell them stories about the times that God rescued me, if I could vulnerably tell them stories about my failure and my selfishness, if I could tell them stories where God was the hero, and then I could tell my grandchildren those stories, and maybe my great grandchildren those stories. The Bible is narrative. When you tell a story about God taking you from a point of hopelessness to healing, when you tell the story about I was in such a difficult spot financially, and I learned these lessons, and here's what God did. Sometimes telling the story is the most essential thing. So as you're getting older, keep telling the same stories, not the ones about your high school. Tell me the stories about what God has done in your life. Build my faith. Make me want to step up and think, if God did it for them, I believe he's going to do it for me. So tell your stories, tell meaningful stories. Here's the second thing I'd say to the older. Avoid despondency. Avoid cynicism. We will do our best to respect you because you deserve respect. But here's a challenge. As we get older, you can become more and more cynical and despondent. And you look at the younger generations and you just are like, the world is going to, you know what, in a handbasket. Like these kids these days, right? Because here's what they do. They spend $80 on a pair of jeans that are already worn out. They got holes all over them. They're gonna get frostbite. Because in my day, we used to work hard and put holes in our jeans. This generation, they just buy the holes. They want to avoid the work. I know you didn't get those holes in your jeans from being on your knees praying. Right? You can just look at the future and like, what in the world is happening? Why would anybody wear their pants that tight? I don't understand, okay? I think the point of it is to remember this. You've got to keep hope as you get older. 2,000 years ago, Jesus looked at a whole bunch of young people. We think that his first disciples were all in their 20s. And he looked at them and he said, here's what I'm going to do. Through you guys, I'm going to build a church. And here's going to be the nature of the church. It's the type of church that the gates of hell won't be able to withstand. I'm going to build a church with a bunch of young people who's just so brazen and so hope-filled that they're going to storm the gates of hell. The only time you put up a gate is when you're in a defensive position. And Jesus says, the type of church I'm going to do is invading hell. It's finding freedom. It's giving people hope. It's stealing people back from one side to the other. Jesus is going to build that church. And Jesus has been building that church through the next generation for 2,000 years. And I guarantee you this. Jesus is going to build that same type of church with his next generation of people. And so when I look at them, I might go like, hey, that's the future? All right. I'm glad you're in charge, Jesus, and not these yahoos. Like you're going to build something through them that I can't yet see. So I'm going to pray for you. And I'm going to invest in you. Now, finally, I just want to give us some general words on this concept of blessing. So these are words to every one of us. Blessing is giving away something. It has nothing to do with your resources. It has to do with your heart. Giving away something to everyone. Number one, give away what has been given to you. Here's one of the goals of my life. I want to go to the grave and take no wisdom with me. Whatever has been taught me by those who've gone ahead, I want to give it all away. If I die with some hidden gem of wisdom, I have failed. I want to just hand it all off. And whether they roll their eyes at me, they're like, Dad, Pastor, oh my goodness. Man, I'm going to give it to you. What you do with it is up to you. But I'm going to give away everything that Jesus ever gave me. Be incredibly intentional about the words that you speak. I have very few regrets in my life. For the people I love most, once, twice, in a moment of emotionalism, I've said some things that I can never take back. criticism, unkindness. I want to be intentional about the words that I speak. That's part of blessing. Speaking life. The enemy is going to speak lies. Part of what you get to do in blessing is you're combating the lies that the enemy is trying to drive into the next generation. He's trying to tell them that they should be filled with shame and they should hide from God and that God doesn't really care. You want to speak the words of blessing. No. Here's what I know about God. He loves you. Here's what I know about God is he forgives you. I'm going to speak these words of blessing to combat what the enemy would say. Speak words that create hope, that create life, that shape futures. Speak words that are true, even if they might be difficult to hear. Speak the truth. Do not hold on to it. I want to end with probably the most famous blessing in the Bible. It's from Numbers chapter 6. This is the blessing that the high priest Aaron was to speak over the people. And here's what it tells us, is that God is a God who blesses. And he wants to bless us. And then we, the people who have been blessed by God, speak a blessing over the future. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.